So this video is to support the material that you'll find here. We're going to set up a database to work with Visual Studio MVC project. We're going to populate the database. We're going to look at how we can then extract some data from the database and then have it appear in views within our application. So we've got this repository here to get you started, and we'll clone this into Visual Studio. So you're going to need, I'm using a clean virtual machine here with Visual Studio 2019 installed on it. So I'm going to fire up Visual Studio, and I'm going to first of all clone a repository, and the repository is this one here, which will get us started. It's got some of the basic setup features already in there. So that's a repository I'm going to clone. It's going to clone into that location there. So let's clone it. So it'll take a second to clone, and hopefully we will see in the Solution Explorer in a second all the files that make up this particular project. So there we go. There's our project, and there we can see we've got our models, our views, and our controllers, and our www root folder. Okay, so you can also, because this was cloned, you might want to use Team Explorer. This is where you could, if you under manage connections here, I'm already connected up using my GitHub account, so you could connect up in here using your GitHub account. So I'm already in. You could sign in, and then I'd be able to stage and commit to the local repository, but also synchronize back across to the repository if that's what I chose to do. So I could look at changes, could commit them and sync. So you've got all the GitHub functionality inside of there. Okay, so Solution Explorer then. This is where we've got all the files, and what we need to do is just look at the instructions. The first thing that we're going to do is make sure that we've got all the necessary packages as part of Entity Framework, because we're going to use Entity Framework to get code to build a database table for us rather than writing SQL. And Entity Framework is an object relational mapper. We're going to create a class. It's going to be a class called film that's going to, if you like, represent one row in of data in our table, in our database. But that class is, we're going to be able to use that to map, to manipulate the data within our application. So Entity Framework doesn't come pre-installed with your MVC application, so you do need to make sure that you've got the necessary packages installed. You will find that by going to Tools and then going to NuGet Packet Manager, and then look for Manage NuGet Packages for Solutions. I've already done this, but you want these three installed. You want Entity Framework Core, you want Entity Framework Core SQL Server, and you want Entity Framework Core Tools. So make sure those are installed. You can browse them through here to find them if they're not installed. This, if you're coming from the Node world, is like npm, Node Packet Manager, similar set of tools to allow you to load Microsoft and third-party packages. So these are the ones I wanted. I've already got them installed, so check that that is the case before you go any further. Otherwise, Entity Framework's not going to work, and you'll get some errors thrown if they're missing. Right, so with those in place, show you what we're going to do is we're going to be creating a model that's going to map to a database table. We're going to call the table films, and it's going to appear like so, with a film ID, a title, certificate, film description, film image, which is going to be the name of an image file, starwars.jpg, a film price, star rating for the film out of 5, and then a release date. So if you were interested, the SQL to construct that table would look like so, and that's basically, we're not going to need to create and run that SQL and the entity framework is going to create that for us through a process known as migration. So I've already set up the model that was in the files you downloaded. So if you go to models and go to film.cs, you can see here's the model that represents that data in a C# class file. So we've got things like our integer as a film ID is the primary key. It's got this data annotation up here indicating that's the primary key. We've got the film title as a varchar. We've got the film certificate as a varchar, so 12, PG, 18. Film description as longer text. Film image says it's going to be the name of an image. And then we've got a price. And then integers for stars. And then we've got a date, time, release date in there as well. So that's what we want our data to look like. That's our model for the data. That's the MVC, model view controller. Notice we've created this as a singular class of film. Okay, so that's all set up, ready for us to use. But we now need to tell our application where our database is and which database we're going to connect to. So I'm going to connect us up now to a tool called Microsoft SQL Server Studio Manager. Got that the right way around? SQL Server Management Studio. Long name, never can remember it. Anyway, this will open up and this is going to allow us to work with our database. When you connect initially, do make sure that you put those that details in as the server name, and then when you connect up, you should see the database over here. And if we go to databases, we see we haven't got our database set up there yet, but we will see that in a second. So minimize that away. We'll come back to that once we've set up. But we need to tell our MVC application, that's the database we intend to use, that's the server that we tend to use there, and we do that through this app settings JSON file. I've already set this up for you. You can see there's the local server setup, there's the name of the database that we're going to choose to create. This is what's known as a connection string. There's some other settings in there that Microsoft say we should put in by default. So that's our key thing. So that's our server name and that's our database name that we want to connect to. And if that doesn't exist through a process of migration, that's going to be created for us. So that's already there for you in the files. You might be connecting to a different database type, in which case you could have different connection strings. So for example, SQLite, but we're going to be using the built-in local MS SQL database. So now with that connection string, we need to feed that into the application, and we're going to do that in the startup file in a second. Before we do that, there's one more bit of setup. Again, I've done this for you already. We need to create what's known as a DbContext. So a DbContext class is the class whose job it is under Entity Framework to manage the database connection and to send queries through to the database. So we do need to set this up. You need to set this up once per project. So once you've kind of done this, you shouldn't really need to revisit it that often. So I've created this in models. I've created application DbContext in models as a class. This is using the DbContext there. You'll see that that is part of Entity Framework. That's why we needed to install the packages. There isn't really much in here other than a constructor, and then the declaration of what's known as a DB set. Now, DB set is a collection of entities. In this case, the entity is film, that model that we created, and we're going to call it films. So notice we've got film singular for our entity, because this is going to be a collection of those, and then films is the name of our collection. You can in effect think of that as being the table name within the database. So with this DB set's important. You could have multiple ones in here if you had multiple tables, but in this first example we've just got the one. So that's all set up and ready. So as I mentioned, we need to tell our application about all of this. And so we can do this through startup. Now startup we've looked at in previous movies where we talked about middleware, and you've got all of these app dot methods in here. These are the middleware. This is the middleware pipeline inside of the configure method. We also have a configure services, and by default you would just get this one here with an MVC, but I've added this second one in here, and this is referencing our default connection. That's where our connection string was, and it's using that to configure a use SQL server DbContext. So this is setting up that database context to use SQL Server, and it's setting it up as a service. Now, when it's set up as a service, it makes it available for something called Dependency Injection, which is going to allow us to use that database context within our application by basically injecting it into the constructor of any particular class where it's needed. So that's an important part of the setup. Again, you do this once and you can use that context as many times as you like within your application. So that's already done for you, but it's referenced in the notes here as well. Okay, so we've got our connection string, we've got our model, we've got our application context, DbContext registered as a service. So we're all good now to undertake something called a migration. So migration is when what we'll do is we're going to get Entity Framework via a command line tool to take all of that information that we've created there and build a migration file, which we can then use to update our database. So this is at the moment done through a command line. So if you go to Tools, NuGet Packet Manager, NuGet, then go Packet Manager Console. It may open up the pop new window, might just popped up in another window like so, but either way, there's my prompt, my packet manager prompt. And so the first thing I want to do is type in add. You've got it there. So you've got add migration, and then space, and then I've used initial, which is just a convention. That's the name that you're giving the migration. It would need to be unique. So I'll run that and have a sip of tea, and it's happy with that. We could reverse that if we wanted to. Notice interesting things happen in the background there. It's created a migrations folder, and what you've actually got in there is it will have gone and it's looked at that model, and you see how it's put together the necessary code to create the table with all the relevant data types. So we'll be able to migrate that, we'll be able to run that in a second against the database. So that is our very next command here, update database. So we'll copy that and we'll run that in here. So it does have to be exactly like that with a capital U, a dash and a capital D. So fingers crossed we'll run that. So we've got build started, build succeeded, and done. Right, great. So now if I go back to Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, let's refresh. And we'll go to databases, and there's our database now that wasn't there before. And if I expand that out, go to tables, there's the films table. I could right click and I could look at the design of it. So that's the design of the table, and we could right click and we could edit the top 200 rows. There's no data in there yet, but there is our table. We could also view it, if you didn't have this tool, you could view it directly in Visual Studio by going to View, SQL Server Object Explorer. Just make sure that this is also connecting to that local DB, which I've got here, and I'll expand that open. Again, there's databases, there's films again. So you see it mirrors what we saw there. There's the tables, as films, and I right click and I can view the data. So there is my data that we just saw through Studio as well, and we could right click and we could look at, say for example, script as. I just want to see what that would look like. That will generate the code to create that. There you go. So there's the SQL that would be needed to create that. Okay, so let me close all those down. It just proves that the data is there. So we're now at a good point where what we should really do is put some data in. So I'm just going to manually add some data in first of all, and then we're all going to see how we can, and then we'll query the database with one record in it, and then we'll populate it with a load more data. So I could have used either Visual Studio or the SQL Server Management Studio to add this in. Film ID, I'm just going to put one row of dummy data in. Not worried about film ID, that's my primary key. So I'll call this dummy film. Let's give it a certificate of 12. Let's just say that it's a dummy description, because I'm going to delete this in a second. Film image, we haven't got one. Price $10.99. Stars, brilliant, 5 out of 5. Release date 2021, January 31st. Okay, click down there and it's put that one row of data in. So let's amend our MVC logic now so that we can actually view that. So there's a couple of things that we need to do. One is initial startup, that once we've done it once, it'll be done for everybody, and that's to use this dependency injection trick to make sure the DbContext is available to my, in this instance, the home controller. So the home controller we've seen in previous movies is going to create all the views in the home directory. So I'm going to go into the home controller. So I'm looking at the extracting on record notes here. And what we want to do is we want to create a private variable of type application DbContext. I'm going to call underscore DbContext. So I'll copy that, and that could go in here underneath the logger, which is already there. And then we're going to inject that as a dependency into the controller, into the constructor of the home controller. So there's already a constructor there that looks like that. It's just registering logger, but we want to register the context as well. So the easiest thing for me to do is probably just copy that and completely replace the existing constructor. So we've now got a new constructor that's taking application DbContext in and assigning it into here. So that's now going to be available to my application. So let's just create a new view then, just to extract one film. So I'm going to create an action in my home controller called one film. It's going to use that context that we've just injected in, and it's going to use the film's DB set of the context, and it's going to use first or default, which is a link. It's a language integrated query that, as the name suggests, is going to extract the first or the default record from our entity collection, which is our table, and we're going to store that in a variable of model, which is of type film, and then we'll feed that to the view. So let me copy that. I'll stick it underneath the existing index action. So there's my new action. So an action in a controller is going to need a view. So let's go to views, home, and then under home let's right click and do add. I'll add in a new view. So let's create an empty one. So this is going to be called one film index.cshtml. Let's add that in. So create a default razor view there for me. I've got some code here that I'm going to use. So this is going to use the model to display the film titles. Let's copy that and replace what we got given there by default. Now there's one thing I do need to change there, because in my notes I wasn't sure what your namespace would be, and the namespace should match the project name. So let's change this to basic film DB project. That will get rid of that error up there. Right, great. So our controller is set up. It's got the DbContext by Dependency Injection, and the view is set up, so we can now launch our application, and fingers crossed this will be the first bit of data that we've extracted from the database and placed in one of our web pages. So localhost arrives eventually, and I'm going to have to type the path in when it does arrive. So we've got home, and then we have one film was what we just created in the controller with a view, and this isn't going to look overly pretty, but we can see there is dummy film, and that is coming from our database. Let's prove that. Let's go into here and let's call that dummy film 2. So we've updated that. Let's just go and refresh here. There you go. Okay, so we can prove that that data is running this part of our application now. Great. Okay, so that's one working. Next thing to do is to load lots more data into here. So we've got one film working. Let's close that down and let's delete what we've got here, because we're going to add loads of data. So let's delete that. And what you got in the sample files was, there was a folder called setup data, and there's this CSV file in there. Looks like this. It's opened it up for me. So this is a comma delimited file. You've got lots of data, I think 60 rows related to lots of different films, and you've got commas separating the different field values. So you've got that's the primary key, name of the film, film certificate, a description, and then over here would be the price and the release date and the star and the film image, all the data that you saw me adding manually previously. Okay, now I'm going to just right click on there and then do open containing folder. It's buried away in the repo, so just make it easier to find. I'm going to take a copy of that and I'm going to put it on the desktop. Okay, so that just makes life a little bit easier when I've got to dig around and find that file in a second. So I'm going to use Studio to do this. I'm going to use SQL Server Management Studio. I've got no data there, so I'm going to go to my database level and right click and then select tasks, import data. This is quite procedural, so bear with me on this. We'll click next. So two parts of this. Where's the data coming from? Well, it's coming from our flat file, and that flat file lives here. We'll browse to find it. So we moved it to the desktop. Where is it? Well, it's because it's not looking for CSV files, so I'll change that to CSV down there. There it is. Let's bring that in. Now, it's a delimited file. What I should have mentioned when we looked at it was that the text, so the big description was placed in quotes so that the commas wouldn't disrupt the delimiting of the fields. So make sure I put a quote in there as the text qualifier. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to untick this column names in first row here, because this would allow us to put the column names in the first row, but we're not going to do that. We've already set the table up. So I'll go down to columns. We can see that's how it's choosing to put the data in, so that looks sensible. If I just scroll down, we can see we've got a good relation there of it's from the delimited into suggested columns. Now if we go to advanced, at the moment it's assuming these are all strings. Some of them aren't. We'd want an integer on the first one, that would be the primary key, for example, and that last one we know is a date, so we should have it select more appropriate data types. And this useful trick here, we can have it suggest types. I'll look for 200 rows to get a feel for the data. We've only got 60, so that's fine. We'll click OK, and it's gone through and it's made some suggestions. So that's now an integer, that's now a date, for example. That's stars, that's an integer as well. So it looks good. Let's click next. We now tell it where our destination is, so where is the data going to get loaded into. So under the drop down, select right down at the bottom, select SQL Server Native Client. There's our local MS DB again, so this keeps cropping up. And that's our database, so that's good. Let's click next. We could have this load into a brand new table, but we've already set up films, so we'll select films. And then I need to do what's known as edit the mappings, so we can see the columns that are getting mapped across with the suitable data types. The one thing to do in here is just to tick this, because film ID is a primary key, and that will respect that as we import this data. So I'll click OK. Let's click next. It gives us a summary of the mappings. So these are all looking green, which is good. So the data that's incoming, it's got a suitable data type for its destination. It's basically what this is saying in summary. We've got to click through some more little messages and then click finish. And off it goes. And we get lots of lovely green there and 60 rows transferred, which is great. So let's close that down. Now I've tended to notice that if I refresh, we don't see the data, which is a bit of a pain. It will appear there eventually, but in Visual Studio it seems to be a bit more robust, because if I go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer, and there's my films, and if I do View Data, there you go, there's all the lovely data. This one will catch up eventually, it just seems a little bit sluggish. Right, so now we've got lots of lovely data. Let's stick it into a web page. So we're going to this time use these notes here, extracting more data. So we've already done all the work with the DbContext and with its dependency injection behavior into the home controller. So all we need to do this time is create ourselves an action, which I'm going to call all films. So let's stick that in our home controller underneath our previous one for one film, and this is going to say, okay, let's give me a to list. So a to list is again, it's a link language integrated query extension method, and it's going to return all of the data from that DB set from films. So this is equivalent to a select star in SQL world, and we're going to store that in the model. So it's going to be a list of film models in a model, and then we're going to send that to the view. So let's save that, and then we need to create the view. So go to views, and at this time we're just going to copy one film, so Control C, Control V, a bit quicker than going through the creation route. And then I'll right click, I'm just going to rename that as all films. Okay, so that gives us a view. Let's change the view logic. In the view logic, we're going to use this razor here, which is going to use a loop to go around the model, and then we can display the film titles. Let's copy that, and we'll have that replace the code there. Right, so let's fire up the server, start debugging, and we're hoping this time that we've got the all films page working as well. That was hyperlinked in my template, so we should just be able to click straight there on here, and fingers crossed, there you go, there's all that data coming in. So we can see that it's extracted all of the films from the database. It's just chucked them into the page without really much thought to the CSS and the HTML structure. So let's just refine that, because I've given you some CSS which this HTML construct will work better with. Notice as well I'm using the images, and I'm using the image name, the film image from the database, to build a path to the image. The images are all in this www root folder, so they were all there for you. So what the database is telling us is which one to use. So let me copy that, and again I'll just replace that. So we've got some HTML here which will match the CSS that I've created for this little demo, and let's fire this up. So this should look a lot nicer. Hopefully we'll get all the images displayed. So localhost is firing up, and in a second we should be able to go to movie list, and there we go, there's all the data. Okay, so all of that data is being generated from the database. If we right click and inspect, you'll see it's looping around, it's creating, for each film it's getting those little div constructs with the name of the film and the image, etc. Great, so that's it. So in my view the kind of floodgates are open now. You should be able to, let's just refresh in here. Is it going to show us the data yet? No. Sometimes a bit slow off the mark this. Let's try edit. No, it's not. Oh, there we go. Eventually. So the data is there as well, just to prove that. And just to, how you could go further with this now is you could have a look at, say, changing the query. It wouldn't be all the films anymore, but you could create a different kind of link query. That's how you create a where query. And you could look at using other elements like the film price, perhaps using the film title as an alt attribute in the image. So have a play around now that you can see that you can extract data and use the data to build more interesting content. And the next thing for you to have a look at would then be what's known as a details page that would lead you towards being able to do a search and results type page. Okay, but thanks for watching. That's the basics to get you going with a data-driven website.